Do you ever feel like things are repeating? Do you ever feel like that everything is the same? Do you get the sense that we can copy everything from the past, except knowing how to make something original? But at the same time, do you feel like you want to jump back to the past, not necessarily to live out a simpler time, but because traditions have become more novel than the present? And even if things were more novel, wouldn't you feel like there's something missing? Do you feel as if you are afraid of speaking your ideas and opinions, even if it seems like common sense to you? I argue that modernism has led to most of today's problems and stagnations. This is why I propose the alternative, anti-modernism. It doesn't mean what you probably think it means. Along with pragmatism, this meta framework explains how I construct my political views. Thus, I made this video to explain it. First, though, what is modernism? The definition on what it is exactly varies, but the one concerning anti-modernism is a framework that advocates that people should use science and a grand narrative to achieve the end of history or an ultimate truth. So, for example, eugenicists claim to have found the next step in evolution. Einstein believed that he was approaching the end of physics, and people such as Hegel, Marx, and Fukuyama believe that they've discovered the perfect society through the Hegelian dialect. They all claim to have the end of something, such as history, war, technology, or disease. The problem with modernism is that it sees individuals in the world as a logic puzzle. Not to say that there aren't objective truths, but the reality is infinitely complex. And even if the laws of reality were fully understandable, the full complexity of the mind can't be understood by another mind, and the full complexity of a society can't be understood by an equally sized society. Unlike postmodernism, anti-modern does embrace science and grand narratives, but for the opposite reason that modernism does. I also want to distinguish this from metamodernism. While there is some compatibility, metamodernism wants to achieve modernism through postmodern skepticism. This results in a new, albeit muddled ultimate truth. Anti-modernism, on the other hand, wants to create a branching number of truths. For example, let's posit that socialism turns out to be superior to capitalism in this society. This is not to say that it is. You can replace socialism and capitalism with any Hegelian conflict, like the Prussian state versus other European states, or neoliberalism versus direct authoritarianism. I'm just using socialism as an example to get to the point. If socialism turns out to be better than capitalism in this society, a modernist would interpret this as a step in the direction of the end of history, or the end of history itself, whereas a anti-modernist would see this as the beginning of history, or at least the beginning of a more significant history. You see, Hegelianism sees history as evolutionary. It's usually modernists because modernists see this evolution as striving towards a perfect society. But we know that evolution doesn't look like this, but rather like this. Now, human civilization is evolving as a collective rather than as individual rulers, which means a deeper and more complex history. It wouldn't really be seen so much as the answer to capitalism, but rather it would subvert the answer capitalism already had. History will not reach the Platonic form of a communist utopia, but branch out and adopt various socialist and post-capitalist systems, such as syndicalism, mutualism, technocracy, AI-driven socialism, and moderate communalism. Anti-modernism makes truths less defined, but opens up the possibility for new truths. And then it will make those truths less defined in favor of new truths, and so on and so forth. Since reality and nature is most likely infinitely complex, this will continue for as long as people want it to. It also forces people to think on the most complex level of thought possible. If we think about it on the model of hierarchical complexity, both modernism and anti-modernism start on stage 11, as both use the scientific method. Modernism makes things simpler, as there's an increasingly limited amount of calculations needed to solve a problem, or a limited amount of elements that are relevant. Anti-modernism requires that thought becomes more complex in an attempt to explain the abnormal phenomenon. What does anti-modernism look like in practice, you may ask? Modernism, in effect, uses progress to create tradition, because why change something if it's already reflecting the ultimate truth? If you know what the end is, and you reach it, there's no need for progress anymore, and thus there is an internal present for modernism. Modernism tends to be centrist and traditionalist, but artificially so. Anti-modernism works in reverse, reviving and preserving traditions and nature. And I say traditions because traditions usually have a lot of naturality to them. But it uses those traditions in a ever-changing context. So it ends up being extremely conservative and reactionary, but at the same time extremely progressive. Modernism can be thought of as an eternal present, whereas anti-modernism is accelerated both backwards and forwards in time. Of course, ideas that are completely new can be embraced. You just have to start with nature. What nature is exactly is a little complex, but in a nutshell, I use nature to mean anything that isn't created by human self-awareness. So it's not just the trees and wildlife, but also human nature, and the natural way in which culture and society develops. For example, let's posit that the autistic Neanderthal theory is correct, or at least that there was a society of autistic people at some point in the past. This is actually likely because of double empathy, the effect in which autistic people communicate in a way that isn't worse than neurotypicals, but is so different that only autistic people can communicate with other autistic people. And when an autistic person communicates with a neurotypical or vice versa, then there is difficulties in communication. So if you're autistic, you can easily communicate with other autistic people, but have trouble talking to neurotypicals. This doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint, unless autistic people evolved not in the neurotypical society, but in their own. Otherwise, autistic people would be replaced by inventive neurotypicals halfway through evolution. A modernist would see a world with an autistic society as part of a linear progress towards some sort of ultimate goal, and so a modernist would try to perfect each step. A anti-modernist accelerates to the end of what would otherwise be a modernist narrative, but don't care so much about achieving the next step as accelerating to the end, regardless of how many people are actually in this society. The intention is less to create a perfect society, but to create an antithesis to the current narrative that neurotypicals are the most abled and moral. This can also be done intellectually, or at least on an intellectual level. Having autistic representation is great, but why stop there? Why not have a show where all the main characters are autistic? Why not also depict an autistic civilization? Most people can imagine one autistic character, but have trouble imagining the interactions they would have with each other. This challenge would force people to look at a new side of nature, particularly double empathy, at least if the show doesn't reinforce the stereotypes previously held. And the same goes for actually building an autistic civilization. You can also apply anti-modernism to otherwise modernist ideologies. For example, a modernist would be a communist because they see it as the end of history, whereas an anti-modernist would be a communist to return to primitive communism as described by Karl Marx. What every ideology that comes from anti-modernism has in common is that it is naturally accelerationist, not worrying about the synthesis as much as it's worried about a synthesis. Notice how both ideologies resurrect a prehistoric civilization, but also jump to what they believe would otherwise be the end of history. Anti-modernism should have moral restraints, of course, as the new thing isn't always better than the old. However, it does provide the meta framework to subvert the full sense of chauvinism by modernism. Not only does it destroy things like over-industrialization, anti-environmental neoliberalism, and autism awareness, as most of them stem from very modernist movements, but this is the means to create new societies, new culture, new art, new states, new politics. This is Autistic signing out.